Hey, so let me introduce myself. I'm Ashley, 17, and this is my story about what's been going on lately with my sister, Jess, and her husband, Jake. I don't really know where to start, but I guess I should say that for as long as I can remember, it's just been me and Jess. She's 25 now, and honestly, she's like my second mom. Growing up, my parents were, well, not the best role models. I don't mean to badmouth them, but they made a lot of bad choices that definitely messed with my upbringing. My sister was the one who had to step in and kind of raise me, and I'll be forever grateful for everything she's done for me. Jess is the kind of person who sacrifices everything for the people she loves, and I've always admired her for it. She never once complained about it, even when it meant putting her own dreams on hold. When she started college, we kept in touch a lot. I call her like 3 times a week just to check in, see how she was doing, and get updates on her life. She'd always tell me about her schoolwork, her plans for the future, and then, of course, about Jake. Oh, Jake. I honestly thought he was like the perfect guy at first. I don't even know why I felt that way, but Jess would talk about him so much, and she made him sound like some kind of Prince Charming. She'd tell me all about the flowers he bought her, the cute dates they'd go on, and how he always treated her like she was the only girl in the world. Coming from a family where my parents' relationship was, to put it mildly, not ideal, I didn't really have a clear picture of what a healthy relationship looked like. So, hearing Jess talk about Jake like that definitely set the bar for me. When Jess introduced me to Jake, it was a big deal. Up until that point, it had always just been me and her. So, meeting him kind of felt like I was finally gaining a brother, even though I was still a little unsure about the whole thing. But he was nice, and he made my sister so happy, so I figured everything was fine. Eventually, Jess and Jake moved in together, got engaged, and then they got married. By the time they tied the knot, I was pretty used to having him around. They seemed perfect for each other, honestly. Things took a bit of a turn when my parents kicked me out. It wasn't like they came to me and said, "Hey, we think it's time for you to go." It was more like they started expecting me to pay rent, which I couldn't afford. I mean, I have a job at this luxury horse ranch, which is honestly my dream job, but the pay doesn't exactly make me rich. On top of that, my job gives me some perks, like free lessons with an instructor and access to practice riding the horses whenever I want. I wasn't willing to give that up just to pay rent to my parents, so I ended up being the one kicked out. I didn't have anywhere else to go at the time, and I didn't want to leave my job, because I love it there. So I moved in with Jess and Jake. Jake works from home, so unless he's off with Jess or at the gym, he's always around. I didn't mind, though. They've always been kind to me, and I figured it would be fine. Jess and Jake weren't just my sister and her husband. They were like my family. It didn't take long for things to settle into a routine. Jake started driving me to school every morning, which was a relief because I was always the one left walking to the bus stop before, and that wasn't always the safest. The school I go to is pretty far, so taking the bus or walking just didn't feel right. Jake would drop me off at school, and he'd pick me up in the afternoon and take me straight to work. Every time he'd do that, I'd feel so grateful. He didn't have to do any of that, but he made it a point to take care of me, and it was honestly really nice. While we were in the car, Jake would make small talk, asking about school, about work, and of course about my love life. I'd get super embarrassed whenever he'd ask if I had a boyfriend or a crush. I'd try to be vague about it because, honestly, I was talking to this guy named Alex who worked at the ranch with me. But we weren't really official or anything. Still, I didn't want to jinx anything by mentioning it. So, I'd keep it casual, and Jake would tease me about it, saying things like, "Come on, there's no way you're not talking to someone. You're too pretty not to have some secret guy." He'd give me this little wink, and I'd just laugh it off. It was awkward, but in a funny way. It was almost like having a big brother I never had. He'd also make comments about how much I was growing up and how beautiful I was, which I didn't really know how to respond to. But I knew he was just being kind. Eventually, Alex and I started talking more. He'd come to the ranch during my shifts to help out, or we'd go riding together when we had some free time. It was nice. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but he was sweet, and we had fun. We started hanging out a lot, and one day, he asked me on an official date. I was so excited. I told Jake about it the next time we were in the car together, but his reaction totally threw me off. At first, Jake just went quiet. I could feel the change in the atmosphere, like the warmth he usually showed me was gone. He asked a lot of questions, which I didn't think much of at first. I thought it was just him being protective, but then when I mentioned that Alex and I had been talking for a month or so, he kind of flipped out. He started yelling at me, saying I was hiding things from him, and called me a liar. I didn't even know what was happening. I started crying, mostly because I had no idea what I'd done wrong. It was like the entire mood shifted, and now he was angry with me for something that seemed so minor. The one thing he said that really stuck with me was, "What about us?" What did he mean by that? I didn't understand. It felt like he was mad at me for getting close to someone else, but I couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was just stress from everything going on, especially with Jess's pregnancy being high risk. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was off. After that, I started noticing things. Little things. Like how Jake would always be outside when I was swimming in the pool or sunbathing. He'd make excuses to be outside, grilling, mowing the lawn, whatever, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. It wasn't just that, though. Sometimes he'd swim with me, which I thought was just him trying to get some exercise, but now I'm not so sure. There were moments when I'd walk from the bathroom to my room in nothing but a towel, and Jake would just be standing there in the hallway, saying goodnight. It wasn't a big deal at first, but now, thinking about it, I feel a little uncomfortable about it. I didn't want to tell Jess anything about it, though. She's been through so much with her pregnancy, and I didn't want to add more stress to her plate. Plus, I didn't want her to think I was overreacting. But now, I'm not sure. Maybe I am overthinking it. I just don't know anymore. I guess the real turning point came on a rainy afternoon. It had been weeks since that argument with Jake, and everything between us had been off ever since. Jess was getting bigger with the pregnancy, and I didn't want to add more tension to the house. I kept trying to ignore the little things that made me uncomfortable. Jake's lingering stares, the way he'd show up unexpectedly when I was alone, or the way he'd talk to me in a voice that was just a little too soft. It was like he was walking a fine line, and I wasn't sure if I should confront him or just let it go. But the more I tried to bury it, the worse it got. It happened one afternoon, when Jess was out with some friends. She was trying to get out of the house for a little while just to relax. I think she knew I was on edge, and wanted to give me some space. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the door creak open. I looked up, and there was Jake, standing in the doorway. His face was different, too serious, like he was gearing up for something. "You're gonna have to stop doing that," he said, his voice too quiet, too calm. It took me a second to process his words. "Stop doing what?" I asked, a little confused. I hadn't done anything out of the ordinary, had I? He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, watching me. I could see the tension building in his jaw. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. His eyes were intense, but there was a nervousness behind them, something I hadn't noticed before. "I know what's been going on," he finally said, his voice lowering even more. "I see the way you've been looking at him." I felt my stomach drop. My mind immediately jumped to Alex. It made sense. Jake had always been a little too interested in my relationships, more than a big brother should be. But still, I wasn't expecting him to actually say anything. And I definitely wasn't ready for what came next. "I told you once you belong here with us," Jake continued. "Not with someone like him. He doesn't care about you like I do." I felt my chest tighten. My throat went dry, and I tried to find the right words, but nothing came out. He kept talking, rambling on about how I was throwing everything away, how I couldn't trust anyone outside of the family, how dangerous it was for me to even think about leaving, about choosing someone else over him. "I always looked out for you," he said, his voice shaking now. "I was the one who was always there. And you're just gonna throw that all away? For him? For a guy who's not even good enough for you?" There was so much anger in his voice, but there was something else too, fear. Fear of losing control, fear of not being the center of my world anymore. I realized then, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that Jake had never really seen me as family. To him, I was more like his possession, something he could control. And in that moment, I finally understood. He wasn't just being protective. He wasn't just acting like a big brother. He was trying to manipulate me. He wanted to keep me close, keep me in his orbit, and the only way he knew how was by making me feel like I owed him everything. And I hated to admit it, but for a long time, I had fallen for it. "I think you need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But there was something in my tone that made him freeze. For a second, I thought he was going to lash out, maybe yell at me, or try to guilt me into staying. But instead, he just looked at me, his face pale. For the first time, I saw the cracks. The mask he'd been wearing was slipping. He wasn't the perfect husband or the perfect protector. He was just a man who couldn't handle the idea of losing control. A man who was terrified of being left behind. "I never thought you'd turn on me," he said quietly, almost to himself. His eyes flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a hint of something that looked like sadness, but I wasn't sure. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't have the words. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, his disappointment crushing me, but I also knew that what I was doing was right. I had to stop pretending everything was fine. I had to stop living in this weird, toxic bubble we'd created. Without another word, Jake turned and walked out of the room. I heard him go upstairs, and then I heard the sound of his door slamming. I stayed frozen for a while, sitting on the couch, trying to process everything that had just happened. It felt like my world had just turned upside down. Later that night, I heard Jess's car pull into the driveway. She was home. She didn't know what had happened, and I wasn't sure I was ready to tell her. Not yet. But it was all too much. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. The next few days were filled with tension. Jake was distant, and Jess noticed. She could tell something was off, but I didn't know how to explain it to her. He wouldn't talk to me anymore. He'd leave for long stretches of time without telling anyone where he was going. I had to wonder what was going on in his head, but I couldn't bring myself to ask. Then one morning, things came to a head. I woke up to the sound of the doorbell ringing. When I opened the door, it wasn't Jake standing there. It was a sheriff. A part of me knew, even before he spoke, that something terrible had happened. "Are you Ashley?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. I nodded, and he told me that Jake had been found. Apparently, he had gone out that night, in the rain, to some bar in the city. He hadn't been drinking or anything, it was more like he just disappeared. They found his car a few miles from the bar, and when they looked inside, it was empty. It wasn't like he'd just gotten out. The way the scene looked, like he'd just left everything behind. I felt sick. I didn't know what to think. Was this some kind of accident? Or had he just snapped? They said it wasn't just an accident. The police had been searching for him for days, and when they finally found him, it was in a small, abandoned house just outside the city. He was alone. They said it was clear from the way he'd been found that Jake had been struggling for a long time. That, in the end, he just couldn't cope with the fact that he was losing control. His perfect world was falling apart, and he didn't know how to stop it. They never found a suicide note, never found any clear reason for what had happened. But they said the look on his face when they found him, it was the kind of sadness you couldn't fake. I didn't know what to feel. I didn't know if I should feel sad, relieved, guilty. It was like I was stuck in this fog of emotions, not sure how to process any of it. But one thing I did know, and that's that the Jake I thought I knew, who was once the man I trusted and looked up to, wasn't the same person anymore. Somewhere along the way, he'd changed. He'd become someone I couldn't recognize, someone who thought that controlling me was love. And now I had to figure out how to move on without him. The truth was, I felt like I'd lost my big brother, but also like I was finally free from his shadow. It was sad, sure, but it was also a relief. As I sat there, looking out the window that rainy afternoon, I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, Jake had never been able to let go. And in the end, it was that inability to let go that destroyed him. It wasn't just the fear of losing control over me, it was his own struggle with accepting the fact that life changes, that things shift, and people grow apart. Maybe he never learned how to deal with that. And now, we were all left trying to figure out how to move on. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.